All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Schentrup. I am the Team Enough organizing fellow slash intern, and I've been helping put on the Zoom school trainings for the last couple of months now. Thank you for joining us for our last week of the Zoom school. We have our partnerships call today, which you are now all on, and then next week we will have our final call on some new programming that Brady is unveiling around suicide prevention. But I want to thank you all for being here on our 14th installment, covering the topic of partnerships. And today we will be going over best practices for starting new partnerships and how you can make sure that you're entering with a spirit of learning and listening, along with building and maintaining trust within your relationships. We will also be discussing how predatory relationships occur and how to ensure that our partnerships do not evolve in that direction. And finally, we will be discussing how to determine where new partnerships would be most helpful and beneficial, and the importance of relationships in generating change. And so without further ado, Bettina, I will turn it over to you, Brady's Director of Partnerships, to begin our presentation.
Thanks so much, Robert, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I am Bettina Lanyi, the Director of National Partnerships at Brady, and I'd like to also introduce real quick Elizabeth Cherish, my colleague at Brady, who is going to be supporting me and does a million and one wonderful things with our partnerships and policy team. I'm especially excited to talk with you all today because I've worked with some of the folks at Team Enough and March for Our Lives on local and national partnerships over the past couple of years. And as we go along in this talk, I'd love for us to have enough time to turn this into a back and forth discussion. I'd love to hear about what some of you all are thinking about and working on during this remote time of organizing during COVID, which has presents itself with a lot of opportunity and certainly some challenges, as we all know. So let me get to the next slide. So I'd like to give you a quick overview of our Brady Partnerships portfolio and talk a bit about how our partnerships help us get our message out and extend our resources, broaden our reach. And when I do so, I want to just give a brief overview, really keep it short so that there's time for folks to ask questions. Robert, is that like I should have asked you, but on chat, people can ask questions, jump in if they'd like.
Yes, on chat for the questions works best, so that way people don't hop on the mic at the same time.
I know for all of you, it's your last week on Zoom school, so you already know that, but I just wanted to double check. But what I'd like to do is first, though, give you a real quick specific message before I go to the 30,000 foot level, and then we can get back to specifics. The specific message is you are your organization. So in any respect, whether you're doing an email outreach or you're showing up in person one day, as we all will again, and as you have in the past, the way that your demeanor and your behavior has a lot to do with the success of your partnership. Partnerships are really just relationships writ large in a professional setting, in an organizational setting. And that's something, if you take one thing away from this, it's something that I'm hoping that you'll remember from that. So just a quick word about me and how I came to be here at Brady doing this work. My background is in public health. I have a master's in public administration from George Washington University that a number of you also attend. I've worked on several democracy and public health campaigns at organizations like People for the American Way and the American Cancer Society on issues including tobacco control and affordable health coverage. And I started organizing, like many of you, when I was in high school, when I started an Amnesty International chapter at my school. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know anything about partnering with people, and we just learned as we went, which is exactly what a lot of you have been doing as well. And that's how you get experience, and that's how you learn things, sometimes for the good, and sometimes that's how you make mistakes and grow. For us, for folks like me, I graduated from high school in 1990, and a large inciting issue for us was Tiananmen Square, which were a set of protests in 1989 in which Chinese students led demonstrations in Beijing as part of a nationwide movement for more democracy in China. Unfortunately, they were suppressed by the military. The government declared martial law, sent the military in with assault rifles and military tanks to kill hundreds and maybe thousands of students. And it was horrible and demoralizing for us, but for a whole generation, it really galvanized us into action. And I want to be sure to bring that up because it's important for all of us to remember the moment that we really turned into activists and why we're all here. It's also important to remember that while all of us, I think, on this call are very active in the GBP movement, we can learn a lot from other movements, and that means we can learn a lot from other partners that we work with and other organizations, because they've had their own battles and their own struggles that they've learned a lot from, whether it's passing legislation or trying to work within difficult systems. And that's an example of something that we can draw from the partnerships that we form outside of the movement, even within the movement. What I wanted to mention was my next activist job, which is during the summers in college, I worked for Greenpeace on environmental issues, knocked on doors for hours every day. And one lesson I learned at Greenpeace that really stuck with me led to the creation of this slide. The first mentor I had the first day and the first week I started knocking on doors told me, you know, when people give you money, they're not giving money to the cause or the organization, they're giving money to you, the individual, because they connect with you. And I gotta tell you, I hated that. I hated that thing. I hated that, and I rejected that, and I said, that's not true. People care about the environment, and that's why they're gonna give me money. And I think that's somewhat true. I was somewhat right, and I was also quite a bit wrong. And so that's why I'll come back to that as a really the principal step, is that people will trust you. If people trust Brady, or if people trust Team Enough or March for Our Lives, it's going to be because they trust you, because you've been a trusted partner to them and you represent your organization. So what I'd like to do now is move from that specific up to the big level and give you a real quick little trip through our partners with just a smattering of the many, many groups that we work with. Some of the sectors of the groups that we work with include entertainment partners, healthcare partners, law enforcement, legal partners with whom we work on amicus briefs to try to get, to try to hold gun dealers accountable and get things like gag rules on talking about safe storage overturned in Florida, for example. We work with news and journalism partners, philanthropic partners, veterans in the military, faith and religious groups. I want to single out mental health and suicide prevention groups real quick, because I think that one of the things that we've learned about partnerships, we've really just learned over the past year at Brady. Prior to that, and I should have said this earlier, but I've been at Brady now 3 years in June, so not quite 3 years, but just about. When I started, we didn't work with any of these mental health partners at all. And there's a really, there are really valid reasons why mental health partners didn't have a lot of trust for Brady and all the other GBP groups, that they really didn't do a whole heck of a lot with. It's because there were concerns, and there are still continuing concerns, that on certain issues that we strongly support at Brady, like universal background checks, that folks who seek out mental health services who own firearms might be stigmatized, might fear seeking out those mental health services lest they be stigmatized for their being a firearm owner. And there's some concerns that as we expand comprehensive background checks, that maybe we might be looking into the background of some of these individuals, and that's absolutely, it's not the case. So about 2 years ago, when Brady launched its End Family Fire Safe Storage program, it gave us an opportunity to reopen this dialogue that we had long had with not had with these mental health partners, and to approach them one by one, set up meetings with them, with a couple of us and a couple of them, and have phone calls and in-person meetings, and then just say, look, let's sit down and listen to you and your concern. Another big concern that they had is that every time there is an incident of a mass shooting that's widely reported, as a lot of you on this call already know, the cry goes out that this is a mental illness issue, and those who are commit mass shootings are generally suffer from mental illness, and that's absolutely not the case. It's one of the myths that's perpetuated in this country to sort of, for a number of reasons, but to sort of deflect the narrative away from better legislation and regulation. And so after meeting with a number of these partners, we told them, we sort of just integrated what they told us, and we said, we're committed to really represent you better in the future when mass shootings occur. And I'm proud to say that we've kept to this promise, and I think that's part of the reason, I know in fact that's part of the reason why they're working with us now on our suicide prevention program and campaign for safe storage. It's because when the shootings occurred in Dayton and El Paso last year, we came out with separate briefings in which we approached each of these, I think almost all of the folks on this slide, to ask them if they wanted to do a joint briefing with us, talking about what a very low percentage of those who commit mass shootings have diagnosed mental illnesses, and that this is just a deflection and not true. And so because we showed commitment to their what was important to them and to their constituents, we gained trust and we helped build that relationship. And that's something we built up really pretty much from nothing. So that's important. Just to give you a little bit of a picture of some of our other partners, there are teachers unions and faith groups here, the National PTA. We have police organizations, we have medical organizations, social workers and community groups. And let's see. We work with medical students and public health groups. There's just a wide range here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but it's important to stop and define what a partnership is. It's a relationship in which two parties agree to cooperate for mutual benefit. The mutual benefit part of this equation is really important because every time you sit down with a partner, whether it's an individual representing an organization or sometimes sitting down at a table with maybe 10 of them, folks who run that organization, it's important to approach that discussion with an open mind and with an eye to what we can bring to them, what they're looking for, what their goals are as an organization. For instance, when we sat down for the first couple of conversations we had with the National Association of Social Workers, we learned a lot. We learned that a big priority for social workers is staying safe, which actually makes a lot more sense now as I'm talking to all of you, because I think all of us, I hope and I believe, have an understanding of the harm that a lot of individuals are in during this time. Folks who are in the service profession, folks who go into others' homes, folks who are caretakers, folks who are in the health and medical profession are really putting their lives at risk these days. Well, for social workers, they always have been. When they go into a home to investigate possible abuse or domestic violence, safety of children, they told us very vividly that, oftentimes there's a hidden gun on the scene and they have to work their way through that situation. So it became important for us to think about safety messaging and protecting social worker safety, and really like rights for social workers, along with our priority, which was initially started out as how can you as social workers lift our message of safe storage when you reach out to folks in the community? How can you talk to people about firearms they might have in their home? So working with them, we figured out what our mutual benefit would be, and we tailored our messaging to reflect that. So some of these mutual benefits, the likelihood of achieving common missions and goals, you can gain new contacts, build public support, awareness, and image. We'll talk a little bit about contacts later. It's one of those things that falls under respecting other partners and not exploiting partners. It's very important to be respectful of partners' ability to hang on to their lists and contacts, and you only want to offer to send something to their lists in as much as they're comfortable sharing those lists. So then moving on to, this is just some of what partnerships with other organizations can do for you and your organization. Here at Brady, our partners feed into our policy objectives and our program objectives and our grassroots, and help our grassroots grow. For instance, in our policy arena, last year in January 2019, when Speaker Pelosi announced the introduction of H.R. 8, the expanded background check bill, we leveraged the partnerships that we had by convening a weekly call with representatives from really up to, at one point it was, I think, 56 organizations that agreed to join us on the call every week, collaborate in educating their memberships about H.R. 8 and S-42 in the Senate, which never got to the Senate floor, and subsequently drive calls and lobby meetings in congressional districts across the country. A lot of groups, everyone across GVP worked so hard on this. We're really proud of our role in convening these external groups, many of whom hadn't ever worked on a GVP issue before, but universal background checks really touched a lot of people right where they lived. And we got a lot of feedback on a petition that we put together that was signed by, I think, more than 30 organizations, like 35 of the organizations signed on to support H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, the Charleston loophole bill that also subsequently passed the House, as well as H.R. 8. And we got a lot of feedback from congressional leaders that they were really impressed by the fact that they saw this list with not just GVP organizations, which is always great, but also different faith leaders from across the spectrum, different community organizations that represented many diverse interests, U.S. Conference of Mayors, Amnesty International, a range of folks, teachers, social workers, parents, educators, grandparents, you name it, really. So it really amplified our message. It means a lot when you can take that, a letter like that to different congressional offices and show them how much support there is in backing a bill of this kind, because they know that that's their constituents. Let's see, we still hold that call every week and keep doing even more with that group. We also amplify Brady programs with our partnerships for our End Family Fire program. As I mentioned earlier, we work with the Ad Council and a wide range of groups to amplify our safe storage campaign. We've worked with entertainment partners to get that message out in Station 19 and other programs. We've pitched it to a lot of groups, and we have gotten a lot of interest and a lot of help from our partners who just really want to get the message out on all the good work we're doing. We've also, for our Crime Guns initiative, we work with community groups on the ground to get our message out and to respond to their community's concerns. So it's really important, obviously, when you work with any group, but especially when you're working with groups at the local level, they're really close to the ground and they know what their communities need. with our Crime Guns Initiative program, we're active in several cities now and we're expanding, but every city has its own story. Every community has its own story, motivation, and the reason why they're getting, how and why they're getting crime guns out of their streets. And it's really important for us to listen and to respond to them and their specific concerns. And finally, just a quick look at something we put together real quick. Brady, March for Our Lives, and AFT, wonderful, wonderful partners all, the American Federation of Teachers, to try to get Mitch McConnell to bring S-42 to a vote in the Senate. While that hasn't happened yet, and we are still pushing, it's really, really powerful for us to take out a full page ad in some major newspapers, because it's not just obviously for Mitch McConnell, it's for all of the folks who read that paper, and then they can see that we're a united front and that we've got the backing of a lot of different groups. So efforts like this one turned around really fast. They can be really powerful for all of us. I'd now like to just move into a couple of the cornerstones of successful partnerships. Some of these seem so obvious, but I can tell you that for each example, I have so many stories that I've heard, and some of you will have as well, of times when these cornerstones are not honored. And so it's important to talk about this briefly. Respect, trust, transparency, and reciprocity are really the four cornerstones that I've come up with. And there are so many more, but I think it all boils down to these. So respect, you respect the organization and its membership as you do your own. You don't look at them like, oh great, here's an LGBTQ group that I can add to my list so we can have this, so we can be intersectional enough, or like, great, this is a child services group, check, now I've got their name and I've got their, email address, and I'll just like send them some stuff sometime. Respect means that you take the time, you make time to sit down and listen to them, learn about their needs, really think about what you can do with them going forward and how your goals may intersect. And they may not, and that's okay. I think part of it is not being a used car salesman about it and not saying like, we'll do whatever, like just trying to like, there are times when we have wonderful, wonderful meetings with people and we just realize like, okay, maybe at this moment our needs don't intersect, but maybe they will down the line. Elizabeth set up a call with someone we've worked with a little bit, Tia Bell of the Trigger Project. And there were some things that at first, the first call, I was kind of like, I don't really know if there's a lot of intersection here. I think they're great, but let's just keep an eye out. And then since then, I think like Team Enough is working with them on something, and they're gonna come talk to our interns. It's the start of something really good. And I bet you like 3-6 months down, they're doing Wear Orange Day now with the GVP movement. I bet like several months down the line, we're going to do so much more with them just because we had that sit down meeting that Elizabeth set up. So you never know. And I think part of respect is I'll jump back and forth, but it goes to honesty, being transparent and honest. I mean, to say like, this is really interesting, but here's where we diverge, and that's okay. It's important to have a mission and to have, to really define who you are, especially in a movement where there are a lot of groups doing a lot of different things, because then they know, and then they can come back to you if they see something that sort of sparks their interest, and they always can. And all of this goes back to trust. I think trust is the most, respect is trust, and trust is respect. Again, as I said at the outset, really partnerships are just like relationships, just in a formal setting, in a structured setting. What does trust mean? I think a number of things. I know our partners trust Brady because, they trust me. They know I'm going to give them information when I have it. If they call me, I'm going to call them back. I mean, it's as simple as that. I'm not going to flake out on them. If I say I'm going to send something, I will send something. And so even though we aren't a very large organization, we also don't pay to play. There are a lot of groups that ask for money in order for us to participate in conferences, and and that's okay, but we haven't done that so far. A, because we don't have the budget for it, but B, because we haven't had to, because if you not always, but in most cases, if you and an organization both have sort of common interests and goals, you can find ways to include them in events and do other nice things for them that don't involve paying them to participate together. And it's always kind of nicer that way, I think, if it's possible. So you want to keep your eye out for something they might be interested in, that you can give them a heads up about, or say, hey, do your members know about this upcoming something that's coming down the pike, or we can make room for you at an event, we'd like you to speak with us. Things like that are really important. Let's see, I do want to bring up one more trust example because I think it's a good one. The US Conference of Mayors is a really strong and influential group. They started working with Brady last January on our HR8 weekly partners call. When the shootings happened in Dayton and El Paso last summer, I guess, we got a call from someone at the US Conference of Mayors to ask us, we're calling a meeting of the board. What's your advice? What do you think that what do you think we should recommend? And what might they get behind? And so they talked to me and one of the folks in our policy team, and we gave them the same recommendation we were giving everyone about how to support universal background checks. And they ended up turning around in a very short time, within like 48 hours, a letter that was supporting universal background checks. And I think 255 mayors across the country from red cities and blue cities alike signed that letter. It was really powerful. And they went sort of on a media tour to talk about all this and talk about the laws that could really strengthen their hand as mayors in preventing those mass shootings from happening in the future. And it was really powerful. So I feel that we're really proud of them for doing that, but we were really proud that we were there for them when they reached out. And that's part of what trust is. It's partly one part picking up the phone, one part they relied on us because we had sent them good information in the past. So transparency and honesty, it's a little hard to define, but it's part of trust. It should go without saying, but let them know where you're coming from, even if you have bad news. If you can't sign on to a letter, just let them, just let them know why. You can tell them that your board decided to go in a different direction, or that you have some concerns about what you're signing on to and you'd rather hold off. It's perfectly fine to say no, as long as you're honest. In fact, it's better to say no being honest. Partner priorities. When you're reaching out to folks, and when you all are at events or you're at a webinar and you're looking into like, wow, who can we partner with? These people sound really great. This other group sounds great too. Some of the considerations you might want to keep in mind: reach, representation, and alignment or bandwidth. It's two different things, but they're kind of on the same level. The reach is, how large are they and who do they reach? And that can be a tricky question. I was just talking with a couple people internally about the American Academy of Pediatrics, a wonderful partner of ours. They reach a percentage of the pediatricians in this country, but not as many as you'd think are official members. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, if they have 67,000 official members, I'm just using them as an example. They're a wonderful, solid group with us. If they have, say, like 60,000 or 70,000 members, but there are many more pediatricians, are they really relying on their news? Well, yes, because a lot of folks maybe they have 400,000 folks on their listserv who aren't officially members because it's prohibitively expensive. For instance, that's just an example. You just want to look behind the numbers and see how big their reach is. Sometimes you've got a smaller group. That goes to the next point, representation. Sometimes you have a smaller group and you're thinking of partnering with them. They might represent sectors and individuals that don't have a voice in society or on our issues, a group you haven't worked with before. We once were considering getting rid of a pamphlet that we had put out on suicide prevention. And then we kind of took it down because it was out of date and we needed to update it on our website. And then we got a call from a really small Department of Health in a really small state. And they said, hey, you know, I know this is really old and I know it's kind of outdated, but we still use it for this Native American group of tribes that we reach out to. And we had no idea at Brady. So we decided after that we're going to just update it and put it back on the website. And that's an example of, well, that's a pretty small group and there aren't a lot of us here, but how, you know, what's the Native American voice or representation in the GBP movement? Is not very large, and it's important for us to amplify their voice and voices, not just one, obviously. Bandwidth and alignment. Sometimes, I think I alluded to this earlier, but sometimes folks' issues might not line up with ours. There's a group that talks a lot about, we're working with violence intervention groups, and that's really important. But one of the, just a general kind of conflict for us is as a movement in GVP, we don't talk a lot about the shooter post-shooting because of the no notoriety, can I say that, campaign, in which you really don't want to give too much attention to the shooter themselves, lest you spawn copycats and you just, on principle, we talk about the victims and the survivors and we don't talk about the shooter. That doesn't mean we can't support or follow groups that do work post-shooting with shooters. But right now there isn't really a common alignment in that one area. That's just one example of many. Bandwidth, there can be a lot of groups doing a lot of great things. You might not have the bandwidth to really support them. At Brady, for instance, it's basically me and Elizabeth on partnerships right now. So we have to kind of pick and choose a bit, but that doesn't mean that they drop off our radar completely. We'll keep them in the loop on, like, you know, bigger send outs and things like that. And you never know, like sometimes months go by and then something pops up and you're like, hey, what about that person we talked to that one time? And you reach out and then, like, lo and behold, they're working on something you might want to work on too with your organization. I want to work it back to this. So as I started out saying, I know it's a very simple message, but you are your organization. Now that I've talked briefly about the 30,000 foot view, a little bird's eye view into our partnership scheme, I'm bringing it back to the specific. It's all down to you reflecting your organization when you reach out to someone, when you have that touch point, that email in person or on Zoom, you're representing Team Enough or Brady or March for Our Lives. So the two real points I wanted to bring up, so it's demeanor and behavior. I think sometimes as organizers, and I started this telling you a bit about how I started as an organizer, and I've done a lot more work since then, but I think as organizers, some of the traits, we're all different, but some of the traits that make us really good organizers, the ability to push through obstacles and really be direct and blunt with people, can be the same traits that might need to be softened a bit in order to approach people or talk to folks that don't have the same interests as us. So it's important always to make sure, you know, are you a pleasant person to work with? Are you being polite? Are you following up on things? Are you giving people room and space to express what they need and what their organizations need? Your behavior with them, every time you see them, are they going to look forward to that interaction or not? And it may seem very basic, but it is really important. And it's something that's going to determine how they feel about just picking up the phone and approaching you. Do they feel like they're going to get a good reception or not? And really, it all comes down to that. And that's actually very good news, because it means each and every person on this call who might be interested in working in building partnerships for their organization has the power to do that. It's simple. It can be very exciting. The most exciting thing that you do in this movement is to build and amplify messaging for people. So if I leave you with one message after this talk, it's that you're ambassadors, and you're the ambassador for your organization. And as that ambassador, there's a lot you can accomplish. So with that, I think I could go into any and all of these things in great more depth, but I want to make sure people have a chance to ask questions as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Bettina. And yeah, now we can hop into our Q&A session. And so the way that we have conducted them in the past, in order to, again, avoid battling over the mics, is please write any questions that you have into the chat function here on the Zoom call, and we will make sure to go through them as your questions come in. But I really wanted to give you the opportunity, Elizabeth, to just touch on anything that you thought you wanted to just reemphasize from the presentation, or perhaps bring in some of your own personal experiences in terms of coalition building, about how you have been able to apply some of the skills that we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, Bettina was very comprehensive and very well spoken, so it's going to be hard to follow all of the incredible amazingness that she just presented. But just a little bit about myself. I too started out as a youth advocate. I'm originally from Newtown, Connecticut, and got involved in gun violence prevention activism when I was 16 years old after the shooting at Sandy Hook. And something that I think is really incredible now, being a professional working in the movement, is just how important a lot of what Bettina is saying, particularly this you versus you equals your organization, as well as thinking about how can you best serve those in which you want to engage within a relationship. And I think of all partnerships, like Bettina was saying, as relationships. They're, friends that you haven't yet met, or friends that you're going to further strengthen. And particularly, I think about, the incredible Tia Bell, who Rob, Bettina, and I have all had the honor and distinct pleasure of working with. What started that relationship and what started that partnership was just attending one of her events, and then reaching out afterwards, setting up the time, and then making sure that you continue on with that. And I think, when Bettina was talking about, do they want to call you back up again? Does someone want to engage in that relationship? That's so important. And I think one of the reasons I really love working with Tia so much, as well as Bettina and Robert, and really all of our incredible partners that we have, is that anytime you pick up the phone, it's not just talking about gun violence prevention. That's, the very tip of the iceberg. It's really sustaining that relationship and seeing how exactly you can help each other and work with each other on this really complex issue that affects all of us in many different ways, but has kind of brought us all to this movement together. And so thinking about, these mental health partners who really weren't involved until Bettina got them involved in the way that they are now. And thinking about, these other organizations who never really found their voice in the movement, in the way that I think young people are really pioneering the way in which we can talk about gun violence prevention, the ways in which we can talk about, the programs that we're working on with End Family Fire, our Safe Storage Initiative, and our Crime Guns program, is really because of those relationships. And it's, yourself, you sell yourself. And those individual connections that you have with people really allow for these groups who may not have been willing to speak initially now feel a lot more comfortable. And I'll cut myself off from talking because I too can go all day. But, really glad that you all are taking the time to participate. And I know schedules must be crazy busy, but it's conversations like these that really allow for us to sustain the movement and sustain ourselves within the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, one point that you hit on, Elizabeth, is, really these relationships that you're building with people being crucially important. I heard the phrase, you come to any movement for the idea, but you stay for the people and the connections that you make. Mm-hmm. And, I think that that's very true, both in partnerships where it's very evident, but also, in a lot of grassroots work. That's very true as well. And all successful chapters that I have seen for any issue have that integral community component that really, allow them to flourish in the same thing, with partnerships. So I love that was, really a large undercurrent of a lot of the presentation here today. And we have a question. It's a fun question, which we don't get to often, but I really like it. And it's for both you, Bettina and Elizabeth, and it's what has been your most influential moment of your career with Brady? Bettina, I will start off with you.
Yeah, there actually are several, but I'll bring one up because it's March for Our Lives related, and it was really powerful. Last April, over a year ago, we had a really hard weekend that a lot of you will remember, in which we had two Parkland survivors in the Parkland family died from suicide, and then a parent survivor from Sandy Hook the following Monday also died from suicide. It was shattering for everyone, for chapter leaders, for March for Our Lives leaders. One March for Our Lives regional director reached out to someone at Brady and was connected to me and said that, we need help. We're at sea here because we're reeling and from this grief and this really trauma that we're experiencing after these deaths, and we need some help. We also have younger people who are younger March for Our Lives members who are reaching out to us, and we're just at sea. We just need help, and we've been reaching out to some local chapter folks, and they're really distressed as well. So we reached out to American Association of Suicidology to ask them for some specific help. And what we realized was we also they helped connect us to the Suicide Lifeline folks who are used to addressing and tweaking messaging folks. And so we did a number of things. We worked with our mental health partners to get a therapist on a phone call with, I think it was Team Enough, maybe it was also for Our Lives folks, I think, to talk them through some of the reactions they might be having, which isn't the same as therapy, but it was something we did to help. And then we also worked with March for Our Lives folks and the American Association of Suicidology to turn around a one-pager that was specific suicide prevention resources for youth who have been affected by gun violence, because really specific kind of trauma. And so although it was a one-pager, but we turned it around really fast and we got it out into the community among multiple people. And I remember my friend at March for Our Lives said, I really feel heard. And we actually did something, and it was a time that was really sad. But even though it was just one thing that we created, it felt like one really small, important, key thing that people would read and see and think, okay, somebody heard me and somebody gets that gets what I'm going through. And even though that's all we could do, it felt like something. And so it felt really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great. And yeah, I remember that weekend. It was definitely really tough for a lot of people, but it's good that we were able to really help folks out, and especially in that time. And like you said, making use of the resources and our connections to really make that happen. And then Elizabeth, I will quickly punt it over to you before we move on to a second question that we got.
I'll be brief, but just to pick up on the theme and the tone that Bettina's talking about, and you just mentioned as well, Robert, with visibility and the importance of recognition. And so the first gun violence prevention organization that reached out to support Newtown advocates was Brady. And that kind of visibility really led for support of the incredible groups that you see out of Newtown. But it's also something that really carries on through all relationships that Brady has. And what was neat really for me was working there's so many great experiences at Brady, but working on the Million Mile March anniversary, they had their 20th anniversary, and this was the kickoff really to the way in which women could talk about gun violence prevention in 2000. Bettina marched at it, my aunt marched at it. Really incredible event that we could have a whole nother, I'm sure, webinar on if it hasn't been touched on already. But what was really great was seeing all of the comments of the women and had helped to organize their social media awareness campaign to recognize 20 years of great activism and leadership in the movement. But seeing all of the women talk on Facebook about, you know, their memories and how they felt seen and how they felt visible just kind of brought me back to that young 16-year-old Elizabeth who felt that same way, as someone who was also an advocate, in less of a professional sense, but feeling seen by a national organization, I think, is something that Brady does incredibly well. And it was neat to have the opportunity to do that for someone else. And to see, you know, the mothers of the movement, for lack of a better word, feel seen and feel recognized for their incredible work and for their incredible activism, was a very powerful moment that probably will stick with me for a very long time. And I know we're
awesome.
time, so I'll cut myself off.
Well, yes, we have about 10 minutes left, so please feel free to add any questions that you have so we can make sure to cover them in the time we have remaining. But the second question is, how would you contact the higher profile organizations out in a lot of these advocacy spaces as possible partners if you're, let's say, a smaller or more community-focused organization?
I think it sort of depends. Recently, for instance, Robert, you and I worked with folks in Virginia to, we were kind of brainstorming together on how to reach out to NAMI, National Association of Mental Illness, and we were like, what's the best contact? So I reached out to a national I had a national contact. But if I hadn't, and if you hadn't been helping the folks in Fairfax, then they might have just contacted the national office. Usually there's an external engagement department. If you don't, sometimes there's a policy or grassroots organizing department. It's always best if you're working at the local or state level to see if there's a local or state chapter, because they're going to have more interest in getting back to you real fast. If you're approaching them like representing March for Our Lives and you're approaching a national organization, then say that up front. Just, call and leave a message. You can call the main switchboard usually, and there's usually like a voicemail you can leave and it'll get to someone eventually, but you can sort of look on their website and get a contact. Or you can, since you work with Robert and me, we can try to have you find the right person. But again, like if it's at the local or state level, you probably want the local or state, like national, like Florida PTA or San Juan Obispo PTA or whatever, if it's at the local level. But if it's the national level, you might need to try a couple of different options before you get to someone. If you are writing them, representing March for Our Lives, representing whatever you're representing, state or local chapter of Team Enough or whatever, do tell them that right up front so they know. And if you get brushed off, don't give up. Just try somebody else, because you never know where that email is going. Could be in spam, or that person might be super busy, might not be the right person. Maybe they didn't forward it along. So keep trying.
And I think just kind of off of that, I wrote for my undergraduate newspaper when I was in college. And one of the best pieces of advice my news editor gave me when I was a freshman is never forget what your position is. And so as young people, people want to talk to you. As young people involved in Team Enough, they want to talk to you more. And really keep that in mind when you're speaking with someone, that you do have power in the situation, and that you can, like Bettina was saying, if they ignored your email, it's not because they don't want to talk to you. There's other things going on, so don't give up and just continue to persist.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Pestering for progress is something that I definitely ascribe to. And it might take a couple times for email to get out of the junk folder or, actually have them see it. So don't be afraid to annoy people until they get back to you, because it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. But I think that, in terms of, the most success that I personally have had, and I know that I always recommend to our chapters, is to, reach out to those local affiliates, whether if it's a national organization or, if it's something like necessarily the APA, where they don't have local chapters, at least to my knowledge. And you want to reach out using that organizational title will definitely help you get in the door. So I really appreciate all the advice you guys have there. And then, yeah, if there's any last minute questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. But since we have 5 minutes left, Bettina or Elizabeth, if you have any closing statements, now is the time.
So much, but I'm going to let Elizabeth has anything.
I think just one of the most important things that you can take away is just how much power you have as an individual. And I really love the fact that this U equals your organization thing is slide, not thing, is still up, because that's such an important point, that it doesn't necessarily matter what someone else's organization is or what their background is. It's a relationship, and it's a conversation that you can continue to have even if the first one doesn't go as well as you had planned. I know that there's a lot of stigma attached to working with different individuals or working with different organizations, or just a lack of awareness in certain things. And you have the ability to change that because of what you bring to the table and of the conversations that you're willing to have. So the sky's the limit. And unfortunately, could not figure less cheesy words in my head. The Tuesday, Monday effect, I think, of a long weekend. But you can really do whatever you set out to do because you have thought through it and because you're pursuing that relationship. And I think the importance of relationships and individuality within that is so important.
Absolutely.
That's an excellent point. And I just riffing off of that for a second. The other thing is, while you're building this relationship with an organization and with an individual, and as Elizabeth says, keep trying if something doesn't work out. Just keep in mind that, especially in in any organization, but particularly nonprofits, because they're smaller, and it's just the nature of nonprofits, is the turnover is pretty frequent, and sometimes people get promoted within the organization as well. So if you're interacting with someone and something isn't quite working, you can reach out again and just see if your message lands any better, if you're having any luck. The other thing that changes a lot, especially with our issue, but really a lot of issues, is that culture shifts happen. So, since Parkland, as we know, organizations view GVP work differently, where they might have thought, oh, this is too political, we don't want to go there. Well, all of that changed when they realized how dire this gun violence epidemic is, and everyone suddenly, not everyone, but a lot of organizations got on the same page, and suddenly gun violence prevention is something they were willing to talk about. So always go back and revisit those conversations if you think it might be worth it. Things might have changed. Their board might have a different person running it. They might have a different point of view. Someone who lost someone to gun violence, which this is an example that's actually happened, might be suddenly the president, and it's their most important issue, like more important than anything else they work on. And that's a relationship you want to build so you can get things done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a really, good example of just how those priorities change over time is, I know that Amnesty International, who's a wonderful organization, has really taken gun violence prevention as a big priority for them recently, and has really dived head on in to helping out in any way that they can, and willing to be, a great partner on this issue. So it's definitely, important to have relationships like that and establish relationships with groups who are really looking to take on this issue. Another one being, I know, the Medical Student Association, American Medical Student Association. They chose gun violence as their big topic that they all wanted to focus on, especially at their Youth Lobby Day up on the Capitol last year.
And we worked with them and Amnesty quite a lot. And I think one of the things we really think is important, and I don't want to give us all credit for sure, but I think it's because Amnesty and Emily and all the folks there have been so great. But they were on our HR8 weekly group, worked with us a lot to get some of their lobby day information. We were so excited to be a part of that. Likewise with AMSA, they're regularly on our call. I think that it helps when you put out good information. The one thing I wanted to mention earlier, like in the respect and the trust, I think if you don't shower people with just random one pagers, but you really, when you turn stuff around and send it out, it's really good stuff. I think that matters. And we've had them ask us, like, we just pretty recently had one of the groups you mentioned say, like, oh, can we use this in our report if we attribute it to Brady? And we're like, yeah, we'd love that. That would be amazing. We're really proud of that. Actually, Amnesty, right after HR 8 was passed, I don't know if everyone knows this or remembers this, but when HR 8 was passed, when it was passed in the very last minute, congressional Republicans inserted a rider that was ICE related, and that would be very punitive toward immigrants. And so they kind of forced folks to vote for HR 8 at the expense of sort of voting on a negative, something that would be punitive toward immigrants. But because that rider wouldn't have been attached to the Senate version, it would never have gone through. And so some groups like Amnesty said, we don't know if we can really support S42 if it's going to have this rider on it. So we kind of had to take a lot of time and say, look, here are these very arcane rules no one would know about otherwise, unless you like really drill down into all the legislation. But yes, no, they did manage to pass the HR 8, the House version with this rider attached, but they will not be able to pass the Senate version with the rider attached. So then Amnesty said, yes, we still support S42, and that was really amazing. We were really so grateful that they hung in and figured that out, So that's just one of many, many wonderful examples. Working together can really yield a lot. And I'll cut myself off because I see it's fun.
Yes, and so we are past the time, and therefore I want to thank everyone for hopping on the call, talking and discussing partnerships with us this afternoon. I hope that you've found some information that you can take forward in your advocacy and take towards your organizations and figure out, how can we better expand our networks, and how can we make sure that we're doing it in a responsible way that ensures equal partnership. And I won't keep going any longer. Thank you, everyone, again, for being able to come on. And our next Zoom school call will be next Monday, and that's going to be on our End Family Fire programming and talking about suicide specifically. I hope to see you all on that call as well. Make sure to look at the channels in which you found information about this call for that upcoming one, and I will talk to you all on Monday. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. And please email if you have any further questions.
Yes, please do. Thank you.